Hello everyone, I'm Abeba Amro-Selassie, the head of the IMF's African Department, welcoming you to Africa Perspectives, where we discuss pressing economic issues faced by regional leaders. Today we're greatly privileged to host Sir Masood Ahmed, a prominent figure in the world of international economics and development. Currently as president of the Center for Global Development, Masood brings a wealth of experience, having played significant roles here at the IMF, as well as the World Bank and the UK's Department for International Development. With an illustrious career spanning several decades and pivotal roles at some of the world's leading development institutions, Masood has been at the forefront of shaping development policy and addressing global challenges. His work, including notably on Africa, offers unique perspectives on how nations can navigate the complex interplay between global challenges and development goals. His career has been marked by incredible commitment to addressing challenges of global poverty and economic disparities. And his philosophy, which I like, centers around the nuanced understanding of the interconnectedness of global issues and the specific needs of developing countries, advocating for policies that are not just economically sound, but also socially inclusive. Masood's contributions, ranging from influencing policymaking to thought-provoking publications, have significantly shaped the discourse on sustainable development and debt policy type issues. And today we'll be exploring his insights and perspectives on the incredibly dynamic landscape that many of our countries in Africa face amongst significant global challenges and beyond. Masood, big welcome to Africa Perspectives, and thank you for honoring our invitation.
Well, Abe, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. It's always great to be back at the IMF, where I spent many years working in different parts of the IMF, and it's also great to be part of this process that you've launched of having periodic conversations about issues affecting African countries and also the interface between African countries and the rest of the world. And I think that is something which it's great to be able to do in a way that is a little bit more in depth. So thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you again. So I'm going to tee off with a big picture question, if I may. Difficult to think of anybody better placed to provide a perspective on this, given how involved you've been in the thinking about development issues at a very high level. And this is, one of the things that strikes me about where we are now in terms of the discourse on development progress is that there's quite a bit of pessimism about the possibility to continue to make development progress. Unlike, say, in the 1990s through the early 2000s, when there was a feeling that there were technocratic solutions to many of the challenges that developing countries made, and with the support of significant official development assistance, this progress can be made. At least from my vantage point in the event, I do see quite a bit of progress having been made. I think development indicators have improved greatly, not in all dimensions, not in everywhere, but in general. But despite this progress, there is quite a bit of development pessimism now, I feel, and mirrored also by a decline in official development assistance and even attention span towards development issues. If I could ask, do you agree with this perspective, and more generally, kind of, your take on this issue?
I think that's a great question. It's also quite a complex question, if I may. And let me try to break it down a little bit in terms of how I think about it. The first thing I would say is that it is certainly the case that when we talk about development today, people are much more uncertain, maybe as much as pessimistic. They're uncertain about how to make progress, And I think that's partly because a lot of the remaining issues where we have not been able to make progress, whether it's communities within countries that have been hard to reach, whether it's countries in conflict where we don't really have very good technocratic solutions, it is harder to make progress in those areas. And it does require us to think about much more holistic approaches, not just technical, defined, narrow solutions in a development technology sense. But in the process of doing that, we tend to forget or not give enough attention to all the progress that has been made. And I think one of the things that constantly frustrates me is that when you talk to young people, particularly about development, they take for granted a lot of the progress that has happened in the last 30, 40 years. And if you just need to keep reminding people of where we were at the time. So I agree with you that the conversation is dominated by the challenges that remain, but in a way it's a little bit natural. That's what the remaining job is. The other thing I would say is that I think there was also a very single-minded focus on development 20 years ago in the rich countries because it was the new project. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall, at the end of the Soviet Union, there's unipolar moment, and the world was searching for a project. And the development technicians came along and said, the project is we're going to help end global poverty and improve development prospects everywhere. The money was there a little bit from the peace dividend. So there's a willingness to increase ODA. We've just gone through a big debt forgiveness, debt reduction cycle through HIPC. So the scope was there to be able to build that. That also generated a bit of trust because we had actually dealt finally with the debt issue. So there was a sense of a common project and people moved forward with a great deal of optimism. And now, when you look at it, I think three things have happened. One is, as I said, the remaining problems are a bit harder to deal with. So there's not the same confidence that we have the solutions. Second thing that's happened is that there has been a much greater awareness of global problems that affect us all, climate being the most obvious one, but then 2 years, we have the pandemic. We still haven't emerged from the pandemic. And the attention has moved towards dealing with those. And the third thing that's happened, of course, is that in the countries that have been providing support for development, there are domestic, both financial, economic, and social problems and political problems that have led to a diversion of resources and attention to those problems rather than focusing on development. And all this happening, of course, at a time when great power rivalry has suddenly re-emerged in a way that has made development part of a broader geostrategic conversation. So I do feel that the environment today is very, very different from 20 years ago when we were looking at development.
Thanks. I mean, again, we can unpack this a little bit more and really like your stab at it. So a couple of questions. One, in your view, is great power rivalry, which increasingly seems to be coming to the fore, is that generally a good thing for development? I mean, I remember the 80s when it meant that there was support for countries unconditional, just simply on account of alignment, unconditional on policies, or the condition, I should say, was just a political alignment rather than attention to the kind of more technocratic solutions that we have in mind. So do you see this as a good or generally bad thing? So what does it portend?
I haven't really thought about whether the net result is going to be good or bad. But you can see, you've just pointed out why it can be both good and bad, right? Because in some ways, if you're a developing country, you now have not just one place to go to, but there are multiple potential partners who are looking to engage with you. And in return, they hope that you will be somewhat aligned with them in fora that could be political or it could be security. So that gives you a little bit more ownership and agency. On the other hand, exactly the point you made, sometimes the money that you got as a result didn't really go to helping people in the country that much. It just was used in ways that, remember, when we did HIPIC 25 years ago, some of the debts that had been racked up in countries in supporting programs and projects that really weren't going to be very economically viable. Mm-hmm. And that's why the countries got into trouble later. So sometimes the money comes with strings, and more recently there's been a lot of discussion, as you know, about whether some of the big increase in financing that has come from the new donors, and notably China, has come with strings attached in terms of conditionality or linked to those loans, or whether they were as tightly focused on programs or not that made sense. So there's always this set of question marks that comes. And I think, good or bad, this is going to be, in my view, the reality within which countries will have to navigate for the next decade.
Thanks. You know, it strikes me that when being where we are, and having been employed, right, still, in my case, it's still an employee of institutions like this, we tend to think about the agency that we have in influencing or supporting countries in the region. But there's also, of course, a very much domestic, political, economic-driven approach to why things have turned out the way they have. Huh? What is in your view, kind of the counterpart of what's happening in the region? That, for example, on development progress, for example, as much as it is aid that has supported countries, it's also been quite a bit of domestic reform and, more democratic space that has facilitated progress. No, if you could give me a little bit your thoughts on how you see the policy-making environment in the region.
I think if there's one overwhelming lesson that learning for me over 40 years, it's been a recognition now more and more of the fairly limited role that external actors play in supporting, changing, influencing the process of development, the path of development within individual countries. If you work for an international organization, that I did for many, many years, that you still do, and you rightly focus on what you can do to help, and I think that's right, that's the reason why these institutions are there. But in doing that, we have to always be conscious that at the end of the day, the decisions that are made within countries that are driven by the economics, by the politics, by the social structures, by the institution, will have a very big impact on outcome. Now, that doesn't mean we should stop trying to help, because there are moments when you can actually have a disproportionate impact, particularly at inflection points. Countries going through a crisis, that's the moment when you can support the people in the country, the reformers who are trying to make a difference, because countries are not monolithic, mm-hmm. and you can be an actor in it. But it is important to recognize, and that's why the reason there's been so much progress in the world, in many countries, is because of what they were doing themselves. I mean, I remember working in Africa at a time when the macro situation in most countries was completely out of control. Inflation was running into the hundreds and thousands of percent. The exchange rates were only held together by administrative measures. Budget deficits were increasingly putting pressures on economies, and And it was just a question of trying to contain the instability at the macro level. Now, over the last few years, it's by and large, even your latest regional economic outlook, okay, inflation's a little bit, still more work has to be done to bring it under control. But by and large, you see macro numbers looking much more manageable. And that has come through hard work over many, many years by governments and by central banks. I think central banks are a big unsung success story in a lot of countries.
Thanks indeed. I mean, we don't give enough agency to how much developments are driven actually by what goes on the ground. So, an interesting point you're making is that the macro picture in Africa had improved quite a bit,
right.
But we have over the last several years seen some deterioration in macroeconomic indicators. Inflation has accelerated some, exchange rate pressures, of course, reserve pressures. So in your mind, how much do you see this as a function of something you mentioned earlier, that maybe the new generation of policymakers perhaps taken the eye off the ball of how important macro policy environment is? That's one factor I see as being a possible explanation. The second one, of course, is the really difficult exogenous environment that countries have been faced with, from the shocks to even deteriorating financing conditions. What is the balance? I mean, of course, it will vary from country to country, but I would love to hear your thoughts on the relative contribution of these factors.
I tend to put more weight on the fact that if you look at the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, really you couldn't have had a greater confluence of exogenous shocks that came and hit countries, right? So whether it's COVID or whether it's food prices, energy prices, whether now it's the increase in interest rates and slowdown in Chinese economy, and as a result, that has an impact on Africa. So all of these things came and hit them, but they also hit everybody else. It's not as, look at our macro number, look at our fiscal numbers here in this country in the US. Never run such a big fiscal deficit in peacetime, right? And so everybody has, in a way, reacted. It's just that, and this is where the difference is, that for a lot of low-income countries, including and particularly the ones in Africa, the ability to deviate from the margin, to deviate from the path, which is the sort of sensible, prudent path, is much more limited. So as soon as they deviate a bit, they run into difficulties. They run into difficulties because their debt numbers are already so high. And there I do think that on the buildup of debt, which has been happening for a decade, not for the last few years, the buildup of debt as a share of GDP has doubled, I think. And the terms on which that debt was taken on, there are countries that were borrowing before COVID at 8-9%. And if you're borrowing at 8 or 9% commercial markets, it's going to be hard to be able to generate projects that are going to pay that off. So there, I think there was a little bit of taking their eye off the ball in terms of, and I would say, frankly, we need to take a little bit of the responsibility on the international community side as well, because we were not raising the alarm on those things quite as much at the time as we do now. But the shocks that came in the last few years certainly made things a lot worse. One other thing is that I think in the process where in a democratic country, there's often the pressures of responding to electoral cycles and also responding to the different social groups, which make it very hard for countries to be able to actually hold the line on spending in particular. And then you see the result of that later on.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, that's what I was going to follow up with. I mean, you said the borrowing terms were definitely aggressive. Even in the period when global interest rates were low, as you said, borrowing terms were 7-8%, if not more. So the question at the time I always felt was, putting yourself in a position of a Minister of Finance, what is alternative, right? I mean, domestic revenue mobilization, of course, but that takes time and often, political pressures are quite a bit. The alternative would be to borrow on more concessional terms, but there was a dearth of concessional financing. As we know, ODA has been declining. And then you have the political pressures to deliver on roads, infrastructure. So, your thoughts on what the international community could have done better to foster or engender a better outcome?
So I'm going to say something that probably won't go down well in the sort of finance complexes of the international institutions. But I do wonder whether we, the international institution, I should say we, but you, the international financial institutions, have been a little bit too conservative and risk averse in the use of their own resources, not so much the concessional resources which come through the institutions, but with their own balance sheet resources. So if you take an institution like the IMF, you've got 1 trillion, 800 billion, something like that in terms of your balance sheet. Now, in terms of using the core money of the IMF, the GRA money, historically, the IMF has been reluctant to use that in low-income countries where you use concessional money because, well, the concessional money is better, but it's very limited in amount. You do $1 billion a year or maybe a little bit more in the period running up to COVID, and then during COVID, obviously, it went up a lot. But then what's the alternative for a country like, whether it's Ghana or whatever, where you get a fairly limited amount from the IMF because it only has very limited. You get quite a limited amount from the World Bank's IDA because, again, the concessional money is limited. Now, you could come to the IMF and borrow regular money, and that time maybe you'd pay 3-4% or something like that, 3%. But since the institutions are quite conservative about not using those resources in the low-income countries, the countries end up going and borrowing at 7 or 8% in the market. And then 5 years later, you've got a debt problem, and you're trying to fix it now. So one thing the international community needs to do is ask itself, what is the role that it can play in a financial sense in low-income countries, of which concessional financing is one part, maybe a large part in some, small part in others, because not all low-income countries are alike. Some can afford to borrow more on non-concessional terms, and others can't. And I think if one can go down that road, that might help a little bit to deal with the problem. But we do have an existing problem which we have to deal with, which is that debt numbers are just too high in a lot of countries, and debt servicing for the next 2 years in Africa. I was reading your last Rio, it's 6 billion a year or so in just commercial debt resurfacing for each of the next 2 years. So there is an immediate problem that has to be dealt with. But looking ahead, I think we have to rethink a little bit the role of international financial institutions.
So, interesting point. I mean, I think we're getting a little bit into the weeds, but I'm really happy to.
Sorry about that.
No. I mean, no, absolutely important question. What you seem to be calling for is, at the IMF, of course, which you know incredibly well, we have this view that our key mandate is to be the counter-cyclical institution, right? When crises emerge or when there's a need for structural a period of adjustment financing, which is when we engage. What you seem to be saying is that maybe that there is a case, even when economic conditions are normal, for us to be leaning forward, and it will be better than the market terms that countries are otherwise able to finance. Is that the solution, or is it to make the size of entities like the World Bank much bigger so that they play the traditional development financing role that they do?
I think ideally you would have much larger development banks. You would make the World Bank much bigger. But I don't really see that happening. And so the question is, I put myself more in the point of view of, given the world in which we live and the world in which we are likely to be operating for the next 5 years, 10 years, what can we do that is more likely to have an impact on helping countries? I think there's a bigger question, Abe, I want to kind of pose to you, because I really think that we should think about this issue, which is, I find there's a little bit of a disconnect between two conversations globally. So one conversation is about needs and potential. And you know, the IMF puts out all kinds of numbers on you need 100 billion a year on adaptation financing in Africa, you need 270-some billion for meeting the NDCs in Africa, you need $1 trillion. So there's all these numbers, and there's a lot of fine-tuning of numbers of needs that generally run in the hundreds of billions and sometimes in the trillions, right? Not just for Africa, but for developing countries as a whole, you get the same sort of conversation. And you also have a conversation of very large numbers, which is about potential. Say, look, I have 130 trillion in assets sitting in the private sector that is ready to be moved, and if you could just move a small part of them, you could deal with development and climate financing needs in countries. So there's this stuff happening. And then there's a separate conversation happening, which is essentially around debt sustainability, the limits to borrowing, the feasibility of absorption, and that is reflected a little bit. If you look at your medium-term growth numbers in the WIO database for Africa, what you see is investment numbers go up by between 1 and 2 percentage points, I think, over the next 5 years, but it's not a huge change. Growth numbers sort of hover around the 4. And that isn't going to solve, that's not consistent with the vision of needs and of potential. And what I'm getting more and more concerned by is that we don't have enough bringing together of these two conversations to have a discussion about what is both a realistic but also for the international community acceptable outcome in terms of how we're going to move forward. Because what's likely to happen, I mean, if the growth numbers that are in your Rio turn out to be a good reflection of what actually happens, then those numbers demonstrate an outcome that doesn't make much of a dent in the needs that we were talking about, which run in the hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars. On the other hand, there's not much point in having a discussion about fine-tuning the hundreds of billions if we have no game plan for delivering on it. Mm-hmm. And so I do feel that one of the things that can be done is to start looking 10 years out for each country and say, well, what is the most likely and acceptable outcome that we could put up with? And then what choices do we have to make given the limitations on finance?
You know, this reminds me of kind of, how fund staff generally find themselves in discussions with country authorities. When we go to ministers of finance, central bank governors, and ask what it is that's going to take to realize a country's potential, right. Often the first thing they put on the table is financing. Of course, right. That's with sufficient financing, they would be able to address a lot of the infrastructure needs, social development spending right. needs, human capital improvement needs, and that is what will unleash stronger growth and realize countries' potential. The international community, on the other hand, sees the constraints being largely domestic reforms, the lack of reforms. Policies, yes. And with sufficient policies, right. There's a lot more scope to do domestic revenue mobilization, etc. And we're often at the heart of this, and of course that's what we try and bridge to strike a balance Absolutely. Between reforms and financing. So my question to you is, question back to you is, yes, I do share, the concern that you have that there's all this tremendous potential, clearly, and absolutely, I think it will be, one way or another. I think I see African countries continuing to make strong progress, but that in the absence of more financing, progress will be perhaps slower than we want to see. So, given your incredible background, how do you see entities like the IMF being able to bridge this disconnect that we often have?
Well, I think by doing exactly what you just said, which is that one is at the country level, where you do actually play a big role in the IMF in trying to help find not just the economically optimal set of policy prescriptions, but working with countries to find what is both economically good things to do, but also feasible for them to do. And a big debate in the past has always been about sort of finding the right balance between optimal and second best solutions, and sort of accepting second best solutions, the way of moving forward. And then making sure that resources that are mobilized and used in a way that deliver the right outcome. The second thing that you can do is much more at an aggregate level, which is what the fund has been very good at, is actually coming up with lots of numbers of need. But where I find maybe the next phase of this is to do the joining up bit. Because what I'd like to see more is, if you read the Fiscal Monitor that the fund puts out, which is the 6th monthly report on fiscal development, you'll see constraints from debt sustainability biting very early. But then you read all these other documents also coming from the fund, from the World Bank, from others, on the need and the potential. And what somebody like me is left a little bit uncertain is, well, how do I connect these two then? I mean, what's the way in which, given these constraints on debt sustainability, on that we can make progress? Or are we saying that we're not going to be able to make that progress? And so I think a little bit of that final phase, if you like, of joining up would be a very good thing, service for all.
I don't want to be too defensive about this, but I think I see initiatives like the Resilience and Sustainability Trust,
right, exactly.
In many ways our attempt to bridge this challenge, generating more money on much longer term than traditionally we have done, to help address countries, in this case, the climate challenge. But the worry I have is, of course, it's still the biggest source of, I think, incremental financing for climate initiatives that we've seen in the last few years, at 40 billion odd, but still not sufficient relative to the scale of things.
At the country level is still relatively small, as you say, for that reason. But, I think it's very helpful to get that extra bit there. Yeah. I think there's partly also a sort of analytical piece alongside it, which is to help people join up the dots and make the connections between sort of constraints on the one hand and needs on the other. I think that's where, if you look at medium term, 10 years, and so what is the likely macro going to evolve? What's the fiscal thing going to be? Fiscal numbers going to look like over the next 10 years? In part as a result of climate change affecting these countries.
Looping back a little bit back to the point that we started off with, like a non-trivial reason why official development support has declined is, of course, the balance sheet of many advanced countries being under, quite a bit of pressure. They too have gone through COVID and all of the other aging, all of the other issues. So how realistic is it really to expect more financing being available to help countries make more progress to SDGs? Or is it that we have to cut, as a developing country policymaker, you have to cut your cloth more to living in an environment where financing is going to be much more circumscribed?
Look, ODA numbers have become both constrained and a little bit misleading, because within the ODA number that you see has gone up. Actually, this year it went up. It went up because of Ukraine and because of the covering the costs in donor countries of hosting refugees for the first year that asylum seekers are covered by ODA. So it so happened, I think a year ago, the largest recipient of Swedish aid was Sweden. Now, you know, that kind of leads you into a bit of a conundrum, because many people will say, well, that's really just a subversion of ODA. That's not what ODA is for. On the other hand, obviously, we would like to see that asylum seekers are properly housed and they're covered and their costs are covered. So the question becomes, where do you account for it? And what I see now is that there is a huge amount of pressure on the principal DAC countries who are ODA providers to use the ODA budget for a variety of things, partly to support countries in their development strategy, but also to cover refugee costs. Humanitarian costs have gone up. There are more. The humanitarian budget has just gone up in terms of the needs as there have been conflicts and natural disasters. And then also to deal with environment, climate. So climate financing, you know, is going up. We in CGD, we did a survey. We asked 25 or so bilateral development agencies whether they expected the share of climate financing in their budget to go up over the next 5 years. And almost all of them saw that as happening. So climate is going to become a bigger part of ODA. And as a result, the core funding that's available to support traditional, what people think of as country-led development, is quite limited. My view, it's going to stay limited. These pressures aren't going away. And my view is that we're going to find that traditional ODA is going to be quite limited, which then puts the pressure on the international institutions, particularly the development banks, because the development banks are the best instrument that the shareholders have for leveraging ODA to deliver larger volumes. So if you think about one number, which I always find quite striking, in the nearly 80 years history of the World Bank, the total amount of shareholder capital that has been invested is around 20-some billion. And with that 20-some billion, the World Bank has been able to make $900 billion worth of long-term development loans. And the other development banks, similar sort of stories. Now, you could have spent the 20 billion directly as ODA for good projects or whatever, but you would never have got 900 billion worth of investments made that the World Bank has been able to do. And I think as ODA becomes tighter and tighter, people will start searching for ways to leverage ODA by using that money through the development banks and other ways.
Fascinating. A very, very eye-popping number about how much, you know, leverage is possible through multilateral agencies. You know, switching gears a little bit, God knows, I mean, I have so many questions on, you know, debt, which we've touched on a few times. Of course, the debt that we see is an outcome of, you know, confluence of factors, exogenous, i.e., you know, borrowing costs having gone up, in some cases liquidity having turned into solvency issues because countries have not been able to roll over, but also traditional fiscal policy having been looser than desirable. But we are where we are seeing a lot more debt vulnerability in the region. And you've had some very interesting things to say about debt. And one which has resonated with me is that you see countries in a way, one way or another, as you put it, defaulting already. You know, of course, directly by countries like Ghana, Zambia seeking debt restructuring and being unable to pay their debt, but also by diverting, in other cases, diverting payment to interest, and so impacting the next generation. So defaulting on the next generation, I think, is the phrase that you used. If you could say a little bit about how you see institutions like mine being able to support countries through this debt challenge in the coming months and years.
The current debt problem, especially as it affects low-income countries, I think is really hard one to solve. It's always difficult to deal with excessive debt because when you restructure or write down debt, it's politically hard to do, technically complicated, and people take a long time getting there. But this time it's even more complicated because the people to whom the money is owed, or which is private and non-Paris Club, which is creditors dominating, and then the multilateral system, all for one reason or the other are reluctant to be part of a grand design solution to reduce debt down. So I don't personally think that there's going to be some grand vision of writing down.
You do or you
I
don't?
don't. I don't think there's going to be some grand vision of writing down debt levels in the next year or 2 or 3. And so the question then becomes, how do we deal with the situation as it is? And what the way I think about it is that 4 years ago, the IMF said that there was a third of low-income countries were at high risk of debt distress, were already there, and that number keeps going up, and now I think it's half, or maybe even more than half, that are high risk of debt distress or in debt distress. And yet the numbers that actually default, quite small, right? And single digit, you just named them. Maybe Ethiopia missed a payment or something a bit, but that's still quite small numbers. And the question that I've been struggling with, well, why is that? And what you see is that interest payments have been rising, and now I think they're about half of revenue in a number of countries.
Not quite, about 20% of revenue in many countries.
Yes, in many, in some there's even higher, And there are countries where they're spending 40% of their revenue on debt service, and they're going ahead with it. So the question is, why are they doing it? And there are two reasons. One is that the cost of defaulting on your international debt for a finance minister is very high. You get frozen out, all manner of things start going wrong, even your trade financing becomes impacted, then your domestic creditors also become an issue, because if you need to then deal with the external debt, and external creditors will want you to deal with your own domestic debt as well at the same time. That politics becomes very hard. And so for them, they're going to postpone this as long as possible. And they look every which way to see, where can I free up money to do this? And the way you free it up is that you stop spending the money that's needed on health. You cut back your expenditures on education, and you basically are, that's what I call, you're defaulting on the next generation, because it's the kids of today who are being shortchanged to continue to pay the creditors. And the other reason why it's very few have defaulted is that the ones that have actually entered into the current structure that we have for dealing with debt restructuring, which is the common framework, have found that it's actually a long, messy, uncertain process. And debt restructuring has always been a difficult process, but it's perhaps even more long and messy than before. So it becomes a deterrent for them, additional deterrent to go down that road. Now, in that situation, what can you do? If you are not going to get a big debt restructuring, I think the international agencies have to see, how can we help with liquidity? so that the payments that are being made, if we're not going to enable countries to, in a reasonable way, go into a state where they stop paying some of their creditors, then we have to help them making sure that the money that they do need for their basic development needs can be financed. And that ultimately raises questions of how do you do that? Which international agencies can provide that financing? Is it by stepped up? Can the IMF come in and do more financing? Can the World Bank and others do that? None of this is going to be easy, and every single solution is, somebody can point out flaws in it. But the question for me is, are any of those solutions better than the situation that we have now, where in effect we are shortchanging the same kids who are going to be running the future for all of us?
Indeed. I mean, I completely concur with you on how difficult it is to make these judgments. I think, of course, the work we do, these debt sustainability analysis,
right,
which provide quite a bit of input into whether a country has reached a point of being more insolvent than illiquid, helps quite a bit, and that's the decision on which we base whether to continue providing financing. But as you said, kind of, because as always, the sustainability and analysis rely on making projections about the future, and we're in such an uncertain environment. The judgment you have to make about, the trajectory for all kinds of variables is a difficult one, and leads to
and the other creditors have to also buy into that analysis. You see, I think maybe there was a time when the IMF was able to make the judgment calls and everybody moved on. But now I think all the creditors also want to get into the discussion a bit more. They want to know whether their assessment of the future is the same as others. That makes the process even more complicated.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, at some level, I think this is akin to what we've seen in other EMs, right, around the world.
Right.
In Africa, I think the creditor base tended to be MDBs
right,
and, of course, the official sector. So there was a lot more reliance on what inputs that we were able to provide. But now you have a diverse creditor base, as you do elsewhere.
Exactly.
So it reminds me a little bit of all the debt talks in Argentina, many other places.
Yes.
Which are always extremely contentious but yeah, I think interesting point. If we could pivot a little bit to climate issues, Masood. This is again another area where there is broad recognition that the African countries in particular, which have made very little contribution to global warming but are being impacted the most, need to be supported in the adaptation needs they have. The challenge there is much less mitigation and more adaptation. And yet the financing that's needed is not forthcoming to support countries deal with these challenges. There's a lot of talk about this $100 billion adaptation need, but very little of that forthcoming. How do you see this conversation evolving? And interesting to see to hear earlier that you were saying that many development agencies are expecting to provide more climate financing, but at the risk of crowding out other traditional development financing. So, how do you see, of course, the climate issues be a lot more than just financing,
right,
but how do you see this conversation evolving in the coming years? And what can policymakers in the region do to better position themselves to influence this conversation?
Well, I would just say a couple of things on it. One is that when it comes to adaptation, I see adaptation in many instances as just being good development. If you're building a school and the building was designed for 35-degree summers, and now it's going to be 45-degree summers going forward in many countries in Africa in centigrade, then the question is your building design going to have to be different if same thing applies to hospitals. And have you factored that cost into it? And maybe it's going to mean that the buildings are going to cost you 15% more to make them resilient for hotter summers. Same thing for your crops. So in almost every phase of development activity, the consequence of climate change and extreme weather events is going to be that we need to build those risks, and not risk, but also trends, into the design of those things, and that will raise the cost. To me, making sure that people understand, the financiers understand, that that extra cost is the cost of building in climate resilience into the basic development agenda, and this is not an either-or agenda. You're shortchanging climate and you're shortchanging development at the same time, in a way, if you don't deal with it, is one big part of the message. And I do think that we need to be better at articulating that if you're dealing with supporting Africa in addressing climate change, you have to be responsible. You can no longer finance school buildings that will need to be left empty during the summers going forward because it's too hot. You have to build that into the design. That's part one. Part two, which I think we don't talk about enough, although some colleagues do now more and more, is about the role that Africa can play in terms of finding solutions to the climate problem. Whether we're talking about the role that you play as a sink for carbon emissions, or the fact that the majority of rare minerals that you need for rare earths and minerals that you need for implementing much of the new technology is going to come from there. How do we make sure that those really positive opportunities can be exploited, and exploited in a way which delivers better governance than sometimes the sort of minerals exploitation of the past has done? Minerals tend to attract both investors and bad governance. They're sort of magnet for bad governance, generally. And how do you make sure that this time around we do better on those? I'm not sure there are enough people focusing on that part in terms of governance and in terms of opportunities. So that would be the second thing. I agree with you completely that when it comes to mitigation, for most countries in Africa, there's very little they can do that's going to have any impact on global emissions. Of course, there are 3 or 4 countries that are going to have an impact. We know there are, as is South Africa and Nigeria. They will have an impact in terms of the choices they make. But for the majority of countries, it's not going to have any impact on any appreciable impact on global emissions. But adaptation and the sort of solutions provision are 2 things which I would like to see push more.
Thanks. Very, very good points. One thing that I wanted to touch on a little bit is this phrase that you've coined, pragmatic multilateralism, in terms of how institutions like the IMF, the World Bank also, can influence discussions on issues like climate change. If you could please elaborate a little bit on that point.
I've used that phrase, pragmatic multilateralism, because it conveys to me it captures how we approach solutions, potential solutions to problems. We used to come from a world, I came from a world, where I would say for many problems, the best way to tackle them is through a cooperative multilateral approach. And so the default for me became finding multilateral solutions to most problems. Mm-hmm. And what I began to see more and more was that the politics of the world today are such that people don't like to find multilateral solutions if they can avoid them. They prefer to try and solve problems either within a country or with sort of groups of countries, but it's not this universal global approach is under pressure for geopolitical reasons, for domestic political reasons. And so I think we have to start thinking much more about where do we need multilateral solutions, not because they're necessarily better, but because they are the only ones that will work. And if we go from multilateralism wherever we can to multilateralism where we must, I think we'll be able to narrow down those areas and get agreement on multilateral solutions, because it will be on those issues where you can't move without them. So, for example, you can't solve climate change without getting all the major emitters into the agreement of some sort. I have a cooperative approach on that. You can't really, to my mind, solve the governance of AI without getting all the key players who need to be part of it. But again, I'm using the term again, I'm listening to myself saying all the key players, which does mean that there are some people who probably don't need to be part of that conversation. And one of the questions I have is that, and this is really, is maybe a lot of our models of trying to find solutions by getting everybody to agree on everything are going to become more and more difficult to implement. And I kind of wonder whether we should start by saying, can we identify those problems where the only way to solve them is through a cooperative multilateral approach?
To push back a little bit on this, isn't that recipe for having kind of a repeat of the outcomes that we've had historically? I mean, just to give you an example, one thing I've heard quite a bit from policymakers in the region when the G20 came up, for example, of the common framework or other initiative, was that there were not enough African policymakers being impacted by many of these initiatives in the room, leading to outcomes.
Completely.
But so when you talk about kind of the key players, I worry that on climate change or AI, that the rule setters will be creating rules that then will have consequences for other countries, non-trivial consequences.
Agreed.
So how do we deal with that side of the equation?
Completely fair point. And I would say, when I say the key player, maybe the right answer is the players who are, the right terminology is the ones who are concerned by it, right? Or are, whose actions will affect outcome, or who are be affected by it. So it's a question of getting the right people in to discuss the right issue. It's a harder question whether everyone who is going to be impacted by an issue must agree with the actions that a few have to take to manage the issue. Because the difficulty is that I don't think the days where you could meet in a small group and set rules that others would have to follow doesn't work for the reasons that you just outlined. And we saw this much earlier as well in many other areas. When you did de-risking of financial flows, a lot of countries were impacted by it, and nobody had even listened to what the impact was going to be on them. But I do worry that trying to get everyone to agree on every problem keeps running into the constraint that now in countries there is much less willingness to go that route.
Masood, really, we could have gone on for much longer. As always, incredibly fascinating to talk to you. And really, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your deep experience and perspectives. Thank you also for joining us, and look forward to providing another insightful conversation in a few weeks' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.